Hi everybody, and welcome to this edition of In Conversation With, where our guest today is a very special guest, Lady Milena Grenfell-Baines. I hardly need to introduce her, so I'm not going to give you her biography, just to say, please everybody give a very warm welcome to Lady Milena. You were born in 1929, and then 10 years later, you were on one of the last kindertransports out of Prague on the eve of the war. But can you give us some kind of flavor what your life was like here growing up in your younger days? What did your family do? That kind of thing.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, thank you. 1929 is a long time ago, so I'm a very old lady. And I can remember very little, actually, of my pre-English days. We lived in a little village called Prosec Uskuče. My father was an accountant to my grandfather's hand embroidery business, where he met my very beautiful mother, and I was born in 29. I had very interesting relations, actually, going back to my grandfather. For instance, he had a grand piano in the house. My uncle, Bernard Kosiner, was the first Czech BBC radio cultural critic. He lived in Prague, but during the holidays, he used to bring some of his friends to Prosec for a holiday, and he brought people like Ježek, like Bohuslav Martinu, who in the history of Prosec, people say he used to play my grandfather's piano, Frejka, but that was before I was born. But I knew the background. My grandfather played the violin. My father played the violin. My mother, when I was 3 years old, sadly died having a second baby. And my father, who'd always had a chest problem, ended up in Luže, which was not far from Prosec, in the sanatorium, where he met my stepmother, who had actually come from Latvia, who was there as a doctor. She ended up in the Czech Republic because studying medicine in Latvia, she was Jewish, and they allowed only so many people in the university, so she came to Prague, and then that's where she met my father in Luže. And together they had a child, my sister called Eva, who's here in Prague with me at the moment. And so we lived there until 1937. But back in 1936, my father heard that Thomas Mann had been expelled from Germany. He was living in Switzerland, and he'd been made stateless. And as famous as he was, he could travel, but only on invitations. And so he had the idea, my father was a councillor, he was a very young councillor. He suggested to the town council that they made Thomas Mann an honorary citizen. Well, it wasn't so simple. At the time, he had to have permission to become a Czech from the president. And he actually came to Prague and met with Beneš. And Beneš said, of course, and he sent my father to Switzerland to offer Thomas Mann Czech citizenship. So he and the entire family actually became Czech citizens, as did Heinrich Mann, his brother. And Heinrich Mann's step-grandson still lives in Prague, I believe. And so that was sort of a bit of a history for Prosec. In 1937, my grandfather's business, business wasn't very good. We moved to Prague, and my mother became a doctor there. My second mother, who was a doctor, and my father became an advertising manager for a medical magazine. And then we had no idea what was going on. I was 8, 9 years old, what was already happening in Austria. We didn't know what Hitler was up to as children. And suddenly, on the 13th of March, 1939, my father got a message get out of Prague, Germans are coming, you're on the list to be arrested, try and get to England. But to do that, they're going to be looking for you. Go to Berlin first, nobody will find you there. And then from Berlin, try to get to England. And so, as far as I know, he left that night. On the train to Berlin, in the carriage, was a lady that Father was telling his story to. And she said, when we get to Berlin, come to me. You can stay with me, and my son will help you to get away the next day. The next morning, a German officer turns up. And my father thought he'd been caught, but this officer was the son of the lady who knew the Thomas Mann story, traveled with him as far as Frankfurt, left him on the train, sent him on to Brussels. It's now the 15th of March. Father gets to Brussels, tries to buy a ticket to England. They won't accept his check money. In the queue, where he's begging the people to sell him the ticket, is a total stranger asking my father, what's the problem? So when he explains, the guy says, my son was born yesterday, so to celebrate it, here's the money. Go to England. Fast forward to 1945. The first thing my father did was to find Henry Bugenhut, who lived in Brussels. My father became a radio amateur. And in 1959, he received a message from Germany that there was to be an international meeting of radio amateurs. Would he like to come amongst the other people? And so he and my mother traveled, I think it was Hamburg, I think. And when he came in, they said, Rudolf, you see that man over there? His name is Joachim Schreiber, and he's the German soldier who helped you 20 years ago in Berlin. They found him, he survived the war, he became a lawyer. So that's a very brief, you could have a whole evening with my father's story here.
It's amazing. Everything's amazing so far.
So that's sort of a brief look back on my little bit of history before we came to England.
We met earlier this year, and you were telling me that you had no memory of the train journey from Prague to London, but still, you were 9 years old at the time. Do you really not remember anything?
It's absolutely true, because I have met in the early years, in the past years, other people, and I've talked to psychiatrists because I've been worried about the fact that I really cannot remember being put on that train. I mean, I know it happened, and I have, my memory of it is this autograph book, because on the evening of parting, my grandfather gave me this autograph book. And I know you all speak Czech, because I'm going to read you what he wrote in it. Milenko, buď pamětlivá toho, aby si byla věrná dcerou národa, z kterého si vyšla, a věrná tvých milých rodičů, jako dědečka, který tě má tak mnoho rád. Praha 31. července, 9 hodin večer, 1939. And he had the foresight to ask some of my aunts and uncles to leave me a message, a farewell. And my uncle Kosiner, the author, also left me, the one who died, the poet. He was a poet and the broadcaster. And this is his message. Milá Milenko, tak jako je jisto, že tento památník ztratíš, tak právě je tak jisto, že ty se nám nestratíš. Kdybych tyhle věci nevěděl s takovou jistotou, nevím, jak bych sem psal své přání, aby ta cesta skončila jako krásné dobrodružství. But of course, we all know what happened. And very sadly, he died very soon. He died of throat cancer, did Emil Kosiner. But you can't find him on the internet because he wrote some poems and some books. So I never lost it, of course. And in it are many names of the friends I went to school with during the war. We'll come back to that. I've got Jan Masaryk in here. I've got President Beneš in here. I've got the headmistress of the school I went to the English school I went to before I went to the Czech school. So this is really my memory, yes. So I really cannot remember that train journey, but talking to others, what children remember is food. Any holiday you go to, you know, you say, well, and so the two things we all remembered when we got to Holland and we were put on this big ship, never seen the sea, going to England, we're all given tea with milk. When I tell this story to the WIs, you know, women in England, tea with milk, well, we poured the bloody tea out. Nobody wanted tea with milk. And we were given white bread sandwiches. And we all wanted our Czech bread. And to this day, believe it or not, there's something about Czech bread that tastes like nothing else, you know. Although in England now you can get all types of bread. But these were just two memories that we have about tea and bread. And then coming to England, we landed in Harwich. And of course, for the journey, we all had to have labels.
Was that around your neck?
Around my neck. And so
Wow.
This is my original label that I wore. I was number 641. For the journey, we needed it's a document. It's not a visa. It says this document requires no visa. As long as we had it, it was a permit to travel. And on the back it says, leave to land granted at Harwich this day on condition that the holder does not enter any employment, paid or unpaid, while in the United Kingdom at the age of 9 years old. Yeah. And it's got the immigration officer the 2nd of August in Harwich. And just to go a bit forward, Harwich, because it was a transit place, was not really aware of what was going on. All these boats landed there and went straight on to London, to Liverpool Street Station. And only about 5 years ago, Harwich woke up to the fact what historical things were happening. And there is now a wonderful statue in Harwich of children stepping off the ships. And every year they now have celebrations of all these refugees arriving in Harwich, and that's only just recent. And so we get to Harwich, and on the train to England, to Liverpool Street Station. Well, there we were met, although my father was already in England, by the way, as I say, he always had chest problems, he couldn't look after us. And a gentleman called Roland Ratcliffe was waiting for us at the station to take my sister and me to a place called Ashton-under-Lyne, right up in Lancashire. That's where we came to. They lived in a terrace house. Daddy Ratcliffe, as we used to call him, was a councillor, a Labour councillor, and professionally, I believe, a baker, but he was very involved with politics. And they lived in a terrace house, 2 up, kitchen with a bath in it, a front room, and the loo in the yard. They had a daughter called Mary who was 16. And because many of the children who came as refugees, brothers and sisters, had been separated, they didn't want to separate us. So they sent their daughter to live with her grandmother so that they could keep us together and give us the other bedroom that they had in the house. And again, I know that we were both very, very happy. I think my 3-year-old sister, actually, we discovered many, many years later, and she went to counselling. She must have been 3. She said she was very angry with her mother for sending her away. That's what she thinks had happened. Because on the journey, she never spoke. I do know that. She was totally silent. The oldest person on our trains, we were 16. I had to look after her. I was 9. And I'm going to skip very forward at the moment because there's a special letter here I want to read to you. I go to schools to talk about my journey, to talk about the Holocaust, and the youngest children I speak to are 11. Now, I always ask the teachers, those children must know something before I come. I can't just go in there and tell them a story cold. So the children, and it's mostly to the 11-year-olds, it's about leaving home. And I get lots of letters. And I have one here which I use to read to adults when they say, what does an 11-year-old get out of your talk? I'm very grateful that you came to talk to us. I was very interested and shocked to hear about what happened to you and all the other children. I have a little brother who is 3, and I sometimes help my mum to look after him. And I can't imagine how hard it must have been to look after your sister on the train. Recently, our class went on holiday to Towerwood, and I was homesick, and I was only away for a week. I don't know how you cope being away from your home for years and years. And sometimes I say to the children, do you ever say, I hate you, to your parents? And they put their hands up. And when I get, for years and years, and when I got off at the school coach, I was delighted to see my mum. And when you saw your mum for the first time, you must have been delighted. And when you said about saying, I hate you to our parents, I really thought about it. And I cherish my parents lots now because I realize how lucky we are to have parents to cherish. Please send my birthday wishes to Sir Nicholas. Yours sincerely, Bethan McCain, year 6. Now, this is an 11-year-old little girl who, and I have lots of letters, but this is an absolute sample.
The family who took you in, the Radcliffes, they sound really like the best of British, the nicest people you could have met. Was it random that you ended up staying with them? And then that shaped your life because then you now have a Northern English accent. You're a Northern English person in many ways.
I have no idea how they chose us, except we know that Daddy Radcliffe was very involved in politics. They must have known they were looking for people to adopt children. They never talked about it. The odd thing is we were one of the few people whose parents were rescued because my mother managed to get out in Norway. And over the years, people who were taken in, the English parents never spoke about the past. My parents, for some reason, never told us how we got to know Winton. It remained a mystery until Esther Ranson discovered Nicky Winton. So 40 years after I got to England, I finally discovered the man who saved me and all the other people. You've probably all seen this Esther Ranson program, That's Life. And if you've seen this new film, One Life, which is brilliantly done, it's absolutely true. None of us knew about Nicholas Winton. And Vera Gissing, who is in the original Esther Ranson film, who was sitting next to me, and Nicky Winton was in the center, had been searching for years to try and find out who had saved her. Discovered she'd only been living 20 minutes away in this next little village next to Nicholas. And so she eventually became like a secretary to him, because from that night, when Esther Ranson said to the audience watching, any of you who came on the Winton trains, please get in touch. It was the following week, they've joined it into one program, it was the following week when she invited him back again, because for the first program, his wife refused to come. When he was asked to come the first time, his wife said, it's going to be a bit boring, I'm going to watch you on the telly, because he didn't know what was going to happen. The second time, when she said, those of you who came on the train, would you stand up? The entire audience, there must have been over 100 people, and he met for the first time after 40 years the people that he had rescued all those years ago.
I'd like to back up a little bit. The last 3 years of the war you spent at a Czech school in the UK.
Yes.
What was that like?
Well, because my father didn't want me to forget my own language, the Czech government opened a Československá státní škola ve Velké Británii. And first of all, we lived in a very decrepit old manor house in a place called Whitchurch, which was literally crumbling. But it was very near a place called Cholmondeley Castle. Cholmondeley Castle had a massive park. And when the Czech army came to England in 1940, when they finally got there, they were actually billeted in Cholmondeley Park, I think 2,000 of them, and amongst them were professors who were then seconded to come and teach us. And the Czechs weren't used to boarding schools. I mean, you only sent naughty children to boarding schools. And we were a motley crowd, Czech, Slovak. Some were from the Sudetenland who couldn't even speak Czech. Our entire education was in Czech. We had the headmaster who was an army captain who'd never run a boarding school. And every Saturday morning, he would inspect every bedroom, and that means, he'd have been thrown out now. Albert opened all the cupboards, if everything wasn't straight, everything was on the floor. Yeah. Our Czech teacher, Professor Krušina, I've got him in my autograph book. I was a very, very poor pupil. If I now admit to tell you že jsem propadla, I must have been the only from Mathematica and Latin, you know. But I was very good at singing. I mean, my whole thing was arty, and in an English school I would have been, you know, sent to the art side. And in this book he writes, Mileno, zpíváš jako tam pěnice, škoda, že chabá je ta tvoje mluvnice. You know, that's it here. So I wasn't very brilliant at school. I was very good at sport. And Mr. Havlíček, my headmaster, wrote in here, hodné, ale škoda, že tak nedbalé Mileně. You know, so my reputation at school wasn't brilliant. But we were like a huge family. And I have names of my secunda and tertia and quarta in this book. And when the school finished in 1945, and many of those children returned to find someone, we remained in touch for years and years and years, and there are not many of us left now, but there is still somebody in Canada, Zuzana Marešová in Prague. I think we managed to track down about 11 out of the, you know, hundreds of students, because they were all slightly older. But again, I say that, you know, I do remember them because we stayed in touch for many years, yes.
When your family stayed in the UK after the war, how Czech was your household? Did you all try to integrate as quickly as possible, or how was your household?
Yes, absolutely, because we lived near Manchester, and there was a very good Czech society in Manchester. My father was the secretary, but we had to, when we were the English family, of course, we spoke English, but at home we had to speak Czech. My father insisted. But we adapted to English customs, we adapted to the way of life in England, we kept our own culture, but there was never this problem, possibly today. We were accepted, we had great English friends, and I can't ever remember any unpleasantness either about being Czech. In fact, people sort of admired us, if you like, and we got to know Czech musicians over the years. And of course, when I left school, instead of going on to an English school, I went to train as a nursery nurse. And then I went to France and worked as an au pair. So we led and my mother then worked as a doctor in the hospital. My father got a job as an accountant. We stayed Czech at home, but we had many, many English friends, if you like, yes.
And of course, later you became a lady.
Well, that was my husband. Yes,
but
yes.
How did you relate to the English class system and all that kind of thing?
Well, all that happened a long time afterwards. I went to France, came back. My father said, I've met a very interesting man, who's an architect. And George actually had two daughters. He was divorced. He was a bit older than I was. But yes, we got to know each other. We married. And I became a total English housewife, still keeping Czech connections, but not speaking Czech so much. I had two more children. I've now got 4 great-grandchildren. And my husband was a founder of an architectural firm. He also came from a very poor background. And at that time, the firm was called by his name. It was called Grenfell-Baines and Hargreaves. But he was a very socialist thinking person. He felt that he didn't want a firm named after him because he said it wasn't fair. He said he had a lot of bright architects. So they rechristened the firm. And it's called Building Design Partnership. And whoever designs anything within the office, it's John Smith from Building Design Partnership. And the firm and the office is now worldwide. It grew. We've got the 3rd generation. But that was one of the things he insisted. He did not want his name carrying on. He said, not right. We've got a lot of gifted people. So I married an architect, which then takes me to the cooking. Because you marry for better, for worse, but not for lunch. That's what they say. But he used to come home for lunch. And then when he got clients, he'd say, well, can I bring so-and-so, home for lunch? So I had to learn to cook very quickly. And that's what happened. One of the stories were that the firm got to know, and they even opened a kitchen for the staff where I used to cook occasionally. And many, many years later, when the firm was successful, there was a message came from the Foreign Office. It wasn't the Foreign Office, not from the palace, it's the Home Office, that his name has been put forward to receive, it was the OB the first time, and then the knighthood. And of course, if he became a sir, I became a lady. Which was very useful if you wanted to buy tickets on a sold-out theatre, Yes.
When we met earlier this year, also with your sister Eva, she told me that you had done a huge amount with young people from the Czech Republic. What kind of things do you do or have you done with young Czechs?
Well, again, this is going back, must be 30 years. Somehow we discovered we were able to invite catering students back to England. And so we got in touch with a number of catering schools here and catering colleges in the north of England. And we would bring over about 20 children for 3 months, place them into English hotels for work experience. And it used to be over Christmas. And then at the end of their stay, they would all get together and cook a Czech dinner for the local mayor, for the dignitaries. And that carried on until COVID, actually. And over the years, as the children left and grew up, they kept in touch. And I can't remember how many slept at my house, yes.
When did you yourself first come back to the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia after leaving at a young age?
Well, actually, I think my father would have liked to have come back at the end of the war. But of course, you saw what was happening. He did come back to Prague once or twice. And in fact, as soon as the war ended, he started collecting clothes and food to send to Prosec, to help with that. And then, of course, he realized, he stayed at the Alcron, and we were always surprised that they didn't arrest him of the things that he used to say. So then they stopped, when the communists took over, all that stopped. I have to tell you that apart from my father, both my grandfather and my uncle were in England during the war, and my uncle joined the Czech Air Force. He came back to Prague. He'd been a communist all his life. He worked in Melantrich, and in 1952 two gentlemen came to arrest him. You know what happened to the Czech soldiers and to the Czech airmen who fought in England. And so he was arrested for 2 years. So we did not come back. We came back properly with my husband. We came in the car for the first time in 1959. And that was a bit dodgy as well. I mean, it was still under, I mean, we were only allowed to stay here for 4 days. We could not visit anybody in their own house. I don't have to tell you what it was like here in those days. We had to account for every crown we spent. And then I came back for the Spartakiada because I was a little Sokolka as a child. That was in 75. And then after that, not at all until I brought the Merseyside Youth Orchestra here in 89-90. That was the first time we really started coming back. And that's another story, of course, with the Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra. Yeah.
You've already touched on when you met Nicholas Winton in the filming of the That's Life TV show. That's very well known. But when did you start to feel like you were getting to know him? When did you become friends with Nicky? Well,
immediately, because I was in the kitchen, the phone goes, "This is Esther Ransom." My answer was, "Oh, I'm the Queen of England." I thought it was a friend who was joking, well, because we all knew who Esther Ransom was. She had this famous program. And she said, no. She said, "What was your name before you became Grenfell-Baines?" I said, "Fleischman." She said, "That's right." She said, "I've got your name on a list. We've found this man, Nicholas Winton, and we would like to surprise him with some of the children that he saved. Could you come to London?" Because I lived, in Manchester. And I had almost forgotten about my past. I hadn't really been that involved with anything Czech so much, apart from my school friends. And I said to her, "I've got 5 friends in London that you can ask." She said, "Well, we've just picked out a few names, so can you come?" So I said, "Okay." So I get to the studio, and I meet up with Vera Gissing and with Hanus Schnabel, with some of the others there. And she said, "You're not to tell him who you are. We're going to bring him in." Sat us on the front row. Exactly, if you've seen this film, this woman that's playing me. Nicholas had been told, now Barbara is writing in her autobiography about him, when they got the news from Esther Ransom, would he come to the studio that they want to talk about his scrapbook? And his wife said, "Oh," she said, "I'm going to watch it at home. It'll be quite boring, So he comes to the studio, walks down, we see this elderly gentleman sitting next to us, and that's when Esther Ransom says, "Well, these are all these names on the list, and next to you is Vera Gissing." Well, that's the first time you saw him wipe his eyes, and Vera threw her arms around his neck, and then I was on the other side of him, and I was showing him my label because, he had completely not forgotten, but as he said then, having done the job all those years ago, been there, done that, kids are safe, I'm getting on with the next thing. He drove an ambulance in Dunkirk, he joined the Air Force, he became a flight instructor, he was a fencer. And if it hadn't been for the war, he would have been fencing in the Olympics, actually. So he said, the children were safe, that was it, I've done my job, didn't want to bother anyone, got on with it. And it wasn't until this scrapbook got into the hands of Esther Ransom via somebody else, and she decided to do this, that, after 40 years, we find the guy who saved our lives.
When you mention him wiping his eye, I can't watch the trailer for the film without, getting something in my eye. I heard during the Czech premiere of the movie that not only did President Pavel dry his eyes, so did his bodyguards. Do you find the film moving also, or is the story too close to you?
Well, it's difficult because over 20 years ago, Matěj Minář made the first film, Síla dobrosti, which some of you may know, which is almost the film of one life, except Nick is in it, we're in it. The guy who is the commentator, Joe Schlesinger, who went to school with me, who became the most famous reporter in Canada in his life. To us, seeing this new film and having seen the first one that Minář made, it was more a clinical, if I can put it, looking at something that we know happened. It's quite different from people who knew nothing about it. The one thing we were all critical about, when he breaks down in the garden, when he's crying, that was not Nicky. I mean, he might have wiped his eyes, but he was a very stoical man, if that's the word. Very cool. He loved parties. He was very sociable. We used to go to his birthday parties in his garden. He played bridge. He loved opera. He used to embroider petit point. Loved visitors. His wife was Danish, very, very sociable, but very unsentimental. And I remember him giving a speech once, and this was in Prague. It was a huge conference. And it was, and at the end of the evening, he said, I'd love to give a speech, but my children are trying to stop me. He said, I like talking. He said, but the two things I want you to remember are ethics and compromise. He said, compromise you have to have even when you're married. Not an easy word. This is well over 20 years ago. He said, but if the world doesn't compromise, it's going to end up in the future a very bad world. And how we're going to compromise today, I don't know, but that was Nicky's, you've got to learn to compromise.
There were hundreds of you Winton children. They had families, of course. Did it mean when you met him and the other children that later in your own life you suddenly had this whole community a whole new community?
And you mean what I'm doing?
That you all knew each other, that you were in contact with the other Winton children, and that you knew their families. Did that happen?
Actually, no, because once we dispersed, and because I lived in the north, a lot of those children came back here and found no one, were not wanted. There was a lot of anti-Semitism going on even then. And so we are now in Australia, in America, in Germany, in France, all over the world. And we managed to keep in touch. And a few of us in London. And then after Nicky, we decided to try a reunion. And I actually organized a school reunion 40 years after. And we met back in the... Actually, we went to... I must go back. The old school that we were in, this crumbling old house, when the ceiling finally fell down, we were transported to Wales, in a village called Llanoted Wells in the Brecon Hills, where it rained all the time. A small village, hardly ever English came, and this troop of Czech refugees turned up, and we were being housed in a very nice hotel for a change. And this hotel had a big dining room. So we decided to introduce ourselves to the village people and invited a whole lot of them and sang a lot of Czech songs for them. But we ended up by singing, anybody Welsh here? My Hen Lan Had I, the Welsh national anthem, the land of my fathers. The village adopted us. And if you go there to this day, any Czechs arriving, a Czech flag gets put out on the town hall. We're still in touch with them. Nobody can hardly remember the school anymore. The school has now been turned into an adventure. The hotel is an adventure school for school children. And in the hall are still photographs of our school during the war. Now, Vera Gissing has written a book, The Pearls of Childhood, Perličky dětství. And when I visited that school a long time ago, the teacher said, "What's all this about?" And when I explained to them the story, the headmaster ordered 40 copies of the book. And each school that comes on holiday gets a copy of Perličky dětství, so that they know about the children, the refugee children who lived there during the war. And I still visit Chlanotid, and they're twinned with Český Krumlov. They have twinning exchanges. So this has been a wonderful connection. Yeah.
Another great story. I think now we could maybe take some questions from the audience if anybody would like to ask a question. There's a microphone at the back. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to put to Lady Milena? Any hands, any takers? Yes, in the front row here. The microphone is coming. If you could wait a second, please.
May I ask you Czech? Já se zeptám česky. No. Já jsem velká přítelkyně vaší přítelkyně paní Pamely Howard a já vím o vás, že milujete Remosku. Můžete k tomu něco říct? Já vím několik story o vás, který mě Pamela povídala a myslím si, že by to bylo moc zajímavý.
Well, by the way, I earlier was doing some preparation for this and I found an old article about you and the headline was, "They call her Lady Remoska."
Well, yes, because but I just, before I do that, I just need to, we're in the Havel Library and I need to
Yes, there's a letter here from President Havel.
Come back to this. When I organized the reunion of the school after 40 years, I not only brought a Czech chef over to cook in the school, I wrote to Václav Havel and I wrote to the Slovak president at the time as well that we've got this reunion. And this is the letter that came back. I can read it. Milí přátelé, you all understand Czech, I'm sure. Dovolte, abych vás všechny upřímně pozdravil při příležitosti vašeho setkání ve vaší bývalé škole v městečku Chlanotid Wells. Jsem velice rád, že i po 57 letech udržujete tuto vzácnou a dojemnou tradici. So it's a lovely letter from him, and the original was given to the town council, but we copied it, and everybody who came to the reunion got it. And we got a lovely letter from the Slovak president as well. And just to go back to Václav Havel again, I've been very involved with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra, and the conductor for 10 years was Libor Pešek. And when Pešek was in Liverpool, he brought the Phil. It was the first foreign orchestra to open Pražské jaro, and Havel and Olga came to it, and we've got a lovely photograph in the dressing room because he was more for pop music, he wasn't a classical man, but he came and he was Pešek's. He and Pešek evidently went to school together when they were young, and so we've got wonderful memories about Havel, and I'm hoping to have wonderful memories about Petr Pavel as well. We're so lucky to have him.
Getting back to the Remoska, tell us
about
the story.
Right, back to the Remoska. Okay. I was in Prague with my cousin, and I said, "What would you like for Christmas?" And she said, "Oh, well, I'm using my mother's old Remoska. This is over 20 years ago." So I said, "Okay, well, we'll go and buy a Remoska." And I came back to England, and I was reading all about what it was, and I could see it was made in Frenštát pod Radhoštěm. So I telephoned Frenštát, and this man said, "Svoboda, prosím." And he said, and I said, "Pane Svoboda, vy mě neznáte, ale proč se neprodává Remoska v Anglii?" I said, "Mr. Svoboda, you don't know me, but why aren't you selling the Remoska in England?" He said, "We don't know anybody." I said, "Oh, he was a new marketing manager." I said, "Well, I happen to know a lady who might be interested." And she was a great friend of mine, and she was a marketing manager for a cookery shop called Lakeland. She was called Michelle. So I had one, and Michelle said, "Well, let me have a play with it." So she came back, she said, I think it might be interesting. Now, in those days, there was no internet, no IT. The only time this firm sold their goods was by mailing people. And Michel came with me. We went to see the Remoska factory. She said, "We're going to risk this. We'll order 1,000 pieces, but before that they had to totally recalibrate all the electricity, everything that you could use in England." And this was in the summer. She said, "By January we would like 1,000 pieces in our shop, and I'm going to write an article about it advertise it." So she wrote this little story. 1,000 pieces arrived, and they sold them in 3 weeks. And now the factory here, they never sort of made things ahead. It was quite poor in those days. They only did things to order. So when Lakeland said, "We need another X," Lakeland lent the factory money to buy the material to make the Remoskas so they could sell them. And in that first year, they sold about 17,000 Remoskas. But for English people, how do we use them? So I had to get a Remoska cookery book by she was called not Havlova, and translate the recipes into English so that people, and we used to go, I had a little team, and we used to go and demonstrate in the shops. And believe me, an hour's demonstration takes 2 days preparation. If you've ever done a demonstration cookery, it's no joke. But we used to demonstrate the Remoska. And over the years, they're still selling them. Remoska has built a new factory in Kopřivnice, beautiful new factory. The designs, the principle is the same, but the designs of the pots have changed. And although everybody's going mad about these air fryers these days, the Remoska is still, and then the Lady Remoska business, a Czech publisher lady came to me, this is before COVID, she said, "We'd like to write a book about the Remoska, and we're going to call it Lady Remoska." And instead of doing Czech recipes into English, I had to translate English Remoska recipes into Czech. So this book is now sold out, but it was great, yes.
Did you say that Prince Charles, now King Charles, also has a Remoska?
Yes, he has. Where's that letter?
Somewhere there was a letter here.
Yes, here we are. There's a famous composer called Carl Davis, who sadly died not long ago, has written a children's choral work called The Last Train to Tomorrow. We've done it here, actually, but it was being performed in London, and we knew that Charles was coming. And it was near his birthday. So Remoska sent me a new Remoska to see whether we could give him one. And they agreed that we could do it in the interval. So we were standing around, and I gave him this box. "Oh, thank you very much." Yes. And it was taken away. A few weeks later, I get a letter. "Thank you very much. I'm sorry, this is a late reply. The Remoska pan is now at Highgrove, and I'm sure it's being put through its paces by the chef. His Royal Highness was hugely grateful for this gift." So the king's got a Remoska. Now, since then, of course, he's a king, and Camilla is a queen. And I need to tell you this. There's a wonderful book being written called When the World Was Ours. It's written by a granddaughter of a Czech. It's fictional, but it's about 3 children, 2 Jewish and 1 not. It starts in 1936, and it's a whole story of what happens, and it's based on a true story. And I always tell them it's the best, and it's written especially for teenagers who know nothing about the Holocaust. And there's hundreds of books, as you know, have been written by survivors. I mean, talking to me, there are so many people with the most unhappy stories in their past. But this book was written especially for young people to try and understand what the Holocaust is about. And it's called When the World is Ours. It's on the internet. I recommend it. Get it if you've got teenage kids who read English. And I got one, and I know that Camilla likes reading, and I sent one to her because she has grandchildren. And she's written back, "Dear Milena, so many thanks for your very kind letter and for the copy of the enormously powerful book that you enclosed. Thank you for everything you do to ensure the next generation will never forget all that you suffered. With my best wishes, Camilla." So they've both got 2 books about the Holocaust and they're in Moscow. Yes. Yes.
Any other questions from the audience, please? Ideally in English, if possible. Yes, Rob?
Hello, Milena. 2 questions. First of all, do you now take milk with your tea? And the second question, having had the honour of meeting Nicky a couple of times, interviewing him, 2 things that really surprised me was, A, to learn about his own Jewish heritage. He was either the son or grandson of German Jews, I think. And the second thing was, I was surprised at how political he was. He was quite outraged at something that Blair had said or something the Labour government were doing at the time. Did he ever show that side of himself to you as a very political socialist person, and and his Jewish heritage? Did that come out in your talks with him?
Not at all. When we met, it was always usually at sort of parties, and in fact, Theresa May was his MP, and we met her at one of his birthday parties. But I love this story about Nicky. Nothing to do with politics, because he liked flying. He was 104 when I got a message from Prague to say that some friends were coming over in a 4-seater Cessna. That's like an aeroplane with 4 chairs in it. Would he like a flight? And he wasn't walking very well. He was quite frail. And his daughter said, well, he said, yes, of course he would. So I drove down to Maidenhead where he lived. And incidentally, he got done for speeding when he was 100 years old. They took his license away from him. We drove to this airport, and there was this Titcher plane. And Barbara looked at it and said, I'm not getting in that. So I climbed in the back, pilot, Nicky, and off we go. Well, every plane has dual controls. The pilot pointed to the one in front of Nicholas, and for half an hour, I was being flown by a 104-year-old pilot. You know, he just took over. The pilot landed the plane, and Nicky got out and said, well, it's just like riding a bicycle, you never forget. But he was definitely not political with us. No.
What about the tea? Do you take milk now in your tea?
Oh, I drink tea. Oh, absolutely. Every WWII meeting, at the end the lady said, would you have your tea with milk? You know, yes, yes, yes.
Any other questions from the audience? Anybody? Anybody? Going? Yes, in the third row here, at the end of the row.
Good evening. I have no question. I only wanted to thank you for the lovely time I had in Preston and in Lancashire. My name is Eva Riza. I was among the students on business school in 1992. And you were so kind that you introduced me to Libor Pešek and other people, Yehudi Menuhin, because you organized also many concerts in Preston. So only now, 32 years after, I appreciate how wonderful time I had with your husband that time, in your garden. I had the honor to taste your cooking. It's wonderful. And that's why I bought 2 of your books, and I would be very obliged if you could sign it for me. 1 copy will be given to the Jewish community in Brno. I came this afternoon from Brno. just to see you after so many years. I thank you.
And I thank you also.
Well, I do remember in 1968, of course, at the time we had about 20 Czech girls working in holiday camps. They could come out at that time. And then, of course, the invasion happened. And the ambassador that used to be here was called Parrott. And Parrott was now professor of European Studies in Lancaster University. And all these girls, I've got them in my autograph book, came to my house. They were all crying, not knowing what to do. Should they go back? Should they stay? And it was Joe Parrott came. So that was one experience that most of them returned back to the Czech Republic. But that was one day when I had them all at my house. Yes.
By the way, Peter Sis, the
Yes.
writer and illustrator, he told me that in 1967 he went to England as a young man.
That's right.
And he had your address, but didn't make it as far as Preston because it was.
Liverpool.
Yes.
We met him in Liverpool. Peter Sis was, because his father was a famous film director. So I knew Peter when he must have been 11 or 12 years old. And of course, since then, he has written this wonderful book, which you've probably seen by now, Peter and Vera. And another little story attached to that book, because in Manchester, we have a very good Czech school. We have a great consul, and this is a Saturday school. And not long ago, they were celebrating Anderson's Night. Now, I believe in this country, children go to the library and spend the night in the knihovna, and they tell stories. And they decided to do Anderson's Night in Manchester, reading Peter's book. So I got in touch with him, and he Zoomed them on that evening. All of us and all these kids in the library, and there was Peter Zooming them about his book. And so I had a lovely letter from one of the children.
A lot of papers here.
It's not here, it's in my bag. Because he's a lovely guy, and of course he lives in New York now, So Peter Sis zoomed Anderson's Night, yeah.
I wanted to ask you also about music. You're here this week on a kind of tour, going to concerts and so on. What's your own connection to music and to Czech music?
Right, back again to the early 70s. The Liverpool Philharmonic came regularly to Preston. They had a season. And one day I had a request from one of the people on the council, could we start a Friends of the Phil organization? Because these friends would possibly raise money. So I put a notice on every seat in the concert hall asking them to sign. And we got 500 members, all of who paid all of £2, which all went to the kitty. And we started the Friends of the Phil. And from that, we started going to concerts just locally. And I also introduced pre-concert talks. We would ask the conductor or a soloist if they would be willing to talk to the audience. And most of them said yes, and they would sit on the edge of the platform, people would sit around them, and we'd have a little chat. Well, from that, it grew, and when Libor Pešek came, as a conductor, I was at that time on the Council of the Phil, and I remember the meeting, and Libor came to be introduced, and I said, "Dobrý večer" to him, and he sort of had no idea that, there was another Czech there. But everybody fell in love with Libor, the entire Liverpool. I mean, he liked the ladies, but he was so great. And so he started taking the orchestra on tours. And the person that I'm with here this week, there are 30 of us in Prague at the moment. We've come special for music. They're called Maestro Tours. And Maestro is the guy who you couldn't interview, is a chap called Ken Grundy. And this is speciality, is taking groups to festivals. And next week, he's actually taking the Liverpool Philharmonic to Japan, and we've travelled with him, and he organises all this. And this week, it's been absolutely non-stop since we've come. This is my third event today. Last night we were at a concert. During the day we were in Strahov and in the church.
You told me, but I've forgotten.
Oh gosh. Loreto. We were in Loreto.
Loreto,
That's
yeah.
right, we're in Loreto. Today they're walking all over Prague. I mean, I've been here with him about 20 times before COVID. We've got English people who've been coming back again and again because they love coming to Prague. We've been to Mariánské Lázně 5 times. We've brought soloists to Mariánské Lázně to play in the Chopin Festival. I used to travel with the Merseyside Youth Orchestra. Again, we came to Prague in 93. We played in Karlovy Vary with them. In Mariánské Lázně, before they converted the concert hall, it was still a very dusty old place in those days. We played there. So, yes, music's been a very big influence in my life.
Earlier you showed me a photo of Zuzana Růžičková, the world-famous harpsichordist. Somebody told me you were related to her.
Zuzana was my cousin, Zuzana Růžičková. I don't know if any of you know her name. She survived 3 concentration camps. She should have come on the train with us, but she begged her parents not to send her. She was 11 at the time, already a very gifted pianist, and was due to go to Paris to study with Landowska at the time, but so her parents kept her at home, and in 1942 she was taken to Terezín. And there she met some of these young composers who eventually also died. And one of them who composed the famous children's chorus, Brundibar, and she sang in that. And she was lucky enough, she said they found an old piano, and in Terezín they were able to, after work, she was given lessons from Gideon Klein and met these people and Schachter. And of course, the conductor who survived, sorry, names are going. And from there she was sent to Auschwitz. And that's another story, because she loved music so much, she kept a piece of paper on some Bach music written on it. And she had it like a talisman with her all the time. And when the day came, they were going to be sent to Auschwitz, and her mother was put in the left queue, and Zuzana was put in the right side. The left queue was for the gas chambers. This piece of paper flew out of her hand, and her mother saw it, and because it was so chaotic, she picked it up, ran to Zuzana to give it to her, and they pulled her into the truck, thus saving the mother's life. And then she was in Auschwitz with her. She managed to survive that. Then they sent them to Dresden to start collecting rubble because of all the Air Force job. And she ended up in Belsen. In Belsen, she became very ill. But because going back, her father, who used to have a toy shop in Plzeň, he had her taught English. She had a governess that, her story goes that when she was a baby, her mother got a nanny, and the nanny had to sing to her. And if she sang flat, she started crying. She was so, involved with music then. So she goes back home, and her old teacher sees her hands, and says, "You could be an interpreter, but, forget about playing." But she went and practiced for 2 years, for hours and hours and hours, and eventually was admitted back to the music school, and eventually met Victor Calabis, the composer. They married, and Zuzana became one of your greatest harpsichord performers. She played all over the world, and I came to her 90th birthday party a few years. She died a few years ago. Yes.
She was a wonderful woman. I knew her slightly myself. Any other questions from the audience? We have time maybe for one more. No? Well, I've got one question, if I may. You're 94. How do you do it? Where do you get the energy?
I'm going to collapse when I get home. Well, I think the Holocaust Educational Trust is always looking for people who could carry on with the story. You know, we're one of the few now who were there, who could be, I can hardly say witness, but we go back to the time when it all happened. So they are asking us to visit and talk about it as much as possible. So we do. But as I say, my story is fairly, you know, as you say, entertaining. There are some people who, the older people, who can remember, I mean, particularly the Austrian people. I mean, we didn't have a Kristallnacht in Prague, but of course, those that went through it in Vienna, there are one or two who still remember that. And there are still many books that are constantly being written about this. Yeah. But we feel it's just so necessary. My sister who lives in the States is doing exactly the same. Although she can't remember anything, she talks about what's happened, and she's a teacher, she's a retired headmistress. So, and I also do some of the talks here in Czech, in some of the schools. And for instance, I'm going to be in Hradec Králové at the end of the month, because we have a school in England near us that for 20 years has been twinned, and we've been running scholarships, and every 3 years, 2 children get a 2 weeks holiday. They win a competition, and I'm about to go and present the prize at the end for 2 kids to come to England for 2 weeks from Hradec Králové. So we constantly have some sort of, sadly Brexit has buggered a lot of stuff up, as you can imagine, but we still keep trying to keep the contacts going. Yes.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you all very much for coming to this edition of In Conversation With, and big thanks to Lady Milena Grenfell-Baines. Thank you.